So welcome to tonight's session. I'm delighted tonight to have two great speakers. The first one we're going to hear from is Stefan Rollnick from Lynn Global, and he is a specialist in misinformation and heads up something that they've called their misinformation cell, which sounds very kind of special forces. So let's delighted to hear what Stefan's got to share with us in terms of insights around how to deal with misinformation. And then we're also going to hear from Chris Paul, who's Manchester based and a former councillor, and was quite heavily involved in the original Made to Move strategy that underpinned the B Network under Chris Boardman. And so those are our two speakers for tonight. But we'll kick off, as ever, with our crowdsourced news section before we hand to Stefan for his talk. So we always like to open up with hearing from people around the country on any news that you might have to share. So do please, opening the floor to you to do that now. Anyone like to kick us off? Adam's got some, and then Madeline. I've got something I wanted to share from Sustrans. Adam.
Yeah, it's a little one. Basically, the the administration that's at Baines put in a sort of modal filter for Queen Charlton. And it sat there for the last 6 months, kind of doing nothing, creating basically, it was a local sort of livable neighbourhood trial. And then suddenly it got picked up by the Bristol Post as one of those sort of accidental great cycle walking routes. And apparently it's also being used for horse riding as well. So that's kind of a positive press thing. What they have done is they've given a key to affected landowners so that they can still access their fields, which I think is really quite a nice model. Hopefully that this will give something for Baines and West of England combined authority to basically go forward with as for creating like a quiet lanes network. But yeah, that's a kind of surprise bit of positive news. It sat there doing very little, and then suddenly the press got hold of it, and it became quite a nice little thing that people are now able to have just accidentally discovered that they've got this really great new route between Keynsham and Bristol. So, this area and Keynsham. So, yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Adam. Madeline, did you have something?
Yeah, it was just to ask if anyone had any experience of a recent active travel route with a cattle grid on it, or one where there was a cattle grid suggested but removed, and just to talk about. So can you just message me privately? That'd be really useful. Thank you very much. And if there's someone from the Oxfordshire active travel, I can't remember, it's called COSAT. Could you message? Yeah, thank you very much. Can I message you, Robin? Is that right? Thank you very much.
David.
Yeah, just a quick update from Birmingham. You probably, those of you who've been on this for a while, you know that Birmingham's got a very ambitious and progressive transport plan. But we had a summit, Birmingham Transport Summit, in the Council House last week, which was very good, and it was a lot of presentations, though. Very positive about how this plan is now going to be delivered. But in terms of what we're going to talk about later today, it was quite noticeable that 3 people quoting conspiracy theories came largely to disrupt the meeting, which in a sense they did quite successfully, because it's one of these meetings in a very large hall, 200 people there. And if you're prepared to speak out, not at question times, the rest of it, but just challenge, it's quite disruptive and got the attention of the Birmingham Post, Birmingham Live, sorry. So that's a bit unfortunate, which makes today's talk very, very relevant. But apart from the problem of how quickly it can be actually delivered, I mean, the transport plan looks good and is on its way. The other thing is, I spoke a long while ago about our attempt to set up a new charity, Walk, Cycle, Play, sponsored by Push Bikes, but trying to broaden the constituency to people interested in children playing, pedestrian needs, disability and things like that, not just cyclists. And we finally got that through the Charity Commission after about 2 years of backwards and forwards. So I hope to say more about that later when we start delivering on that. That's all.
Thanks. Mark.
Hi, just a couple of things. Just wanted to remind everyone it's the 3rd anniversary of the first active travel COVID-related scheme that went in on Madeira Drive in Brighton, which was actually the 20th of April, but we didn't have a thing last week, so this is the 3rd anniversary. Although people seems to have forgotten about it, and other things got in the way the last few years. I just wanted to echo David's points about disruptive people and conspiracy theory. I'm standing in the elections, and there have been a couple of people on the doorstep saying you just want checkpoints with guns. That's what's coming next, and you're just a stooge in that agenda. So people are out there, and it'll be interesting to hear the talk about what you do when you're faced with somebody like that. And also just wanted to pass on, Adam Broncos just messaged me to say he can't get in. So I don't know if there's anyone else who can't get in.
Yes, if Adam Reynolds.
Yeah, I'm admitting everybody then there. So
thanks.
yeah, so there's only one waiting at the moment, and she's
okay.
Two.
H from Glasgow. Don't know if you can hear us, H, but if you've got anything to share, now's the time to do it. The thing I was just going to mention was people might have seen Sustrans petition around, adding your name to petition to put pressure on Mark Harper around the cuts. So I've just posted that in the chat if people have seen that. Did I post that in the chat?
I've just been able to unmute myself on the Android. It's fiddly little job that. Yeah, some interesting discovery. This month is 4 years since Ashley Lennon was killed on Pollokshaws Road by a left-turning Jewson's lorry operated by Saint-Gobain. I had a delivery from Saint-Gobain this morning and was chatting about the driver. He was charged with causing death by careless driving. It was not proven, but the very design of the road at that point invites the sort of crash that happened. What is annoying that 4 years later, the pedestrian railings that were ripped apart and crushed by the crash are still ripped apart and crushed with the ghost bike attached. I think 4 years of having road infrastructure damaged by a fatal crash, still having it in place, is pretty appalling on Glasgow Council as the Roads Authority. So that annoys me. And also found out some more stuff about a couple of other fatals following up the very moving appeal that was done on Saturday last. I think you also reported on it, Claire. And I think we got the link to that now, where Shelley gave the eulogy to the woman who died.
Yeah, I posted that last week, H. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, so that's an update on those things, and I'm just stirring it happily, trying to get more bikes on buses in rural areas. So I've got a few more irons in the fire there, because the cyclist who died on the A85, you don't really want to cycle that road. You're much better getting on the coach or the bus that's travelling that length of road to get past it.
Thank you. Rachel, let's make this the last one, and then we'll ask Stefan to move into his talk.
Yeah, just to let people know, I met my MP last week on Friday. He's a Conservative, and Leicestershire, don't forget, is kind of the bottom of the pile in terms of active travel, England and assessments and so on. And he was actually, I was quite surprised, pretty supportive. He's going to contact Selene Saxby, who leads the All Parliamentary Group, in terms of, putting more pressure regarding funding. So I'm sort of thinking, if somebody like him and Leicestershire are doing this, that gives me a little bit of hope, and it should give all of us a little bit of hope. So yes, I'm waiting to hear back from him. He said he'd come back to me with her response and then go up to Jessie Norman and so on. So yeah, so I just thought that might be a little bit of, hopeful news for people.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we always like to have a bit of good news as well as the disappointing news, and also always good to ask for tips as was done tonight with the cattle grid example. So do feel free to put your asks into this section as well. Okay.
Just wanted to jump in just quickly. For those people, I've posted the new meeting link for those people that are trying to get in that are having problems, and you're getting messages from them. Copy that link because they may be using the old meeting link.
Thanks,
No,
Adam.
the problem is that it wasn't in the meeting invite. So everybody's scratching around trying to find the link.
Absolutely. It's just one of those.
Problem.
Yeah, let's not eat up the session. We talk about it in the chat if useful. But thanks for that, Adam. Thank you, Rachel. Right, let's ask Stefan to take the floor now, and we'll move into our first speaker section. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much. And I've got 10 minutes, haven't I? Which I'll probably do a futile attempt to try and get through as much as possible. But maybe what we'll focus on doing is giving you something of a bird's eye view of the challenge, and we can get into more detail where there's questions, where it's relevant. And I do urge you to connect with me after the session if there's questions that we don't get round to. There's concerns you have that are still unaddressed, and I'll make an effort to share these slides in this presentation, which signpost to some pretty useful resources for anyone interested in what we can do about mis and disinformation. So it's just gone 5:15. Let's see how I can do. So to kick us off, just so you know who I am, I'm from Lynn. We are a global communications agency focused on behavior change. I am the head of the misinformation cell, which sounds very glamorous, and people are often incredibly disappointed when they meet me in person. But it's my job to make sure that the work that we do that's designed to improve and save lives, most notably in the realms of health and climate, are protected from mis and disinformation. And I suppose there's a question here, which is, what does it mean to protect something from mis and disinformation? And if it's of use and interest, we can get into definitions, we can get into the details and the weeds of that. But I think sometimes it's more helpful to zoom out and not think about this in terms of information that is correct or incorrect or somewhere in between, but actually to think about this through the lenses of these broader culture wars. And we can define culture wars as things that people shout at each other about on the internet. And I think when we zoom out and view this challenge through this lens of culture wars, we begin to understand why the same people that 2 or now 3 years ago who are out on the streets holding placards about global Bill Gates conspiracy theories to take over the world using vaccines are now out on the streets of Oxford with placards with 15-minute cities written on them, with disinformation and conspiracy theories ranging from everything from climate change denialism, frustration with the local authority, all the way through to global anti-Semitism. And there's a reason why we find these beliefs clustered together. And the reason why is conspiracy thinking or conspiracy theories. And we can think of conspiracy thinking as a way of seeing the world, which sees it through the lens of in-groups and out-groups, locked in a competition for resources or power or influence. And this battle takes place on the backdrop of a secret cabal of individuals pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And when we think of it through this lens, it makes much more sense why it's so easy for a person to throw their weight behind anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, only to jump on to 15-minute city conspiracy theories a year or two later. It's because all of these conspiracies have at their heart this shadowy cabal of elites, whether that's the Bill Gates Foundation or whether that's the European Climate Foundation. And they have their outgroups, whether that's left-wing politicians or progressive activists and climate activists or scientists and doctors. And so when we think about this through this lens, it begins to make a bit more sense as to some of these people we're encountering on the doorstep. The way of thinking, the lens through which they're seeing the world begins to become a bit clearer. And a useful way of thinking about this is thinking about it in terms of what makes us vulnerable to seeing the world in that way? What makes it more likely that we're likely to connect some of these unconnected dots into a coherent but often harmful narrative that can damage public health, can damage climate action, and put minority groups in danger. And the literature shows us a number of things, but broadly speaking, there's 3 C's that we can think of. So the first is control. We feel like we're losing control of our circumstances, or our autonomy is being threatened. We become more vulnerable to these stories about in-groups and out-groups and secret cabals of elites pulling the strings behind the scenes, because we're more sensitive to the fact that our lives things are being done to us that we haven't necessarily consented to. And these conspiracy theories focus our anger and our attention onto a scapegoat. So in the context of low traffic neighborhoods, this scapegoat might be the council, or it might be Greta Thunberg, or it might be climate activists more broadly. And this gives us this sense of regained control and autonomy and purpose. And purpose is the other one I want to touch on. The second C is community. If we feel socially isolated and cut off from those around us, we become more vulnerable to these stories, because often associated with these movements, 15-minute cities movements, anti-vax movements, is this sense of community and purpose. And the third is comprehension, which is to say, if we feel overloaded by information, contradictory information, information that's true, untrue, somewhere in between, and I think we all have felt like that over the last few years, we become more vulnerable to these stories because they join unconnected dots together to create this coherent narrative. And so this gives us a bit of context about where some of this thinking and these theories are coming from. But when it comes to low traffic neighborhoods, just like with the anti-vaccine lobby, it's important to remember that the conspiracy theorists we see online aren't necessarily broadly representative of the audiences we're dealing with in real life. If we just took Twitter as a snapshot for our assessment of how many anti-vaxxers there were in the United Kingdom, the idea of getting to herd immunity would have seemed farcical. Yet actually, when we look at vaccine uptake, there was a lot more promising signs in terms of how people built trust and got their information around vaccines. And I think it's the same when it comes to decarbonizing the way we travel around our cities. I think as local decision makers or campaigners, we owe it not to find ourselves in the pocket of the NIMBY lobby, who are the loudest on social media, but actually think about all the other stakeholders in this that we're making this change for. The people who rely on bus routes that are increasingly being stripped back and are desperate for access to our city centres. The young children who are growing up on the side of busy roads with polluted air, who don't have a voice in this debate, the generations who haven't even been born yet, who don't have a voice in this debate. And I'm based in Cardiff, Wales, where we have a Future Generations Commissioner who applies pressure on decision makers to think about these stakeholders as well. Now, in my presentation, which we won't get round to most of it, there's a series of recommendations that I make for both organisations, which come from a government toolkit, which I will share with you after this session, and you can take a look at in more detail. I make recommendations for human beings if you're someone on social media who wants to engage or wants to fight back against mis and disinformation about things like LTNs online. And please do push me for real life experiences you're having where I can speak to them and give you some concrete feedback. But this is all stuff you'll be able to get into in more detail. I've also got some information here about a framework that we use here at Lynn, and we've designed a unique survey methodology around this framework, but you don't need us to go away and do this. This framework can be used without some grand survey built around it. It's something that you can go away and action in your online communities. It's a way of understanding what mis and disinformation to respond to directly and where maybe to challenge it indirectly. And please, if that's something that you'd like more on, make a note of it now and we can get into it in more detail. Key message here I wanted to get across. This is an example of some pro bono work we did for the PR and comms industry in Ukraine around Russian disinformation. And again, I can get into more detail on what we did there if it's interesting. But the important thing to remember is this line at the top, which we drum into ourselves here in the misinformation cell at Lynn, which is that sometimes the best response to a lie isn't a fact, it's a deeper truth. And the challenge for us in fighting disinformation isn't to play whack-a-mole with every piece of mis and disinformation we find, but to understand what concerns are being exploited by those spreading disinformation, understand what vulnerabilities we have that are being exploited by those spreading mis and disinformation, and then try to understand what does it mean to construct the truth well told? What are some of those deeper truths and those values-based arguments we can make to resonate and connect with our audiences? And then here there's a little bit more fleshed out, and I won't go through every bullet point in detail, but this is a strategy called proactive promotion, which comes from the Wall of Beliefs toolkit. And it's about telling this story, this truth well told strategy, which is particularly relevant to LTNs and disinformation about LTNs, where we have beliefs that are core beliefs to people because LTNs, they believe, threaten their sense of autonomy, but are unlikely to cause direct harm in the way that, say, misinformation about injecting bleach to cure coronavirus is likely to cause direct harm. And so proactive promotion provides a model for us to start pushing back against that. And so you'll appreciate this is an hour-long set of slides that I've naively put into a 10-minute presentation. But I just wanted to also say, if it's of interest to people, we can talk about what it means to have that real-life conversation with somebody who's been taken in by mis and disinformation. And again, it will be unsurprising for you to hear that what the science says about the best way to speak to someone who's been taken in by conspiracy theories or mis and disinformation is to not correct them relentlessly to the point where they feel stupid and defensive, but to try to meet them where they are before bringing them with you. Understand what they're trying to say about their needs and their concerns, and frame your policy and speak to it in a way that addresses those needs and concerns. And so, Claire, I will zip it now and maybe leave it to questions to see what in that whiz through the slides is of most interest and use to this group. Make some attempt to answer some of the initial questions, and then maybe throw it over to future catch-ups to get into some of the other stuff in a bit more detail. But like I said, we'll be sharing all of these resources after the session. And also thank you so much for letting me crash. It's great to be here.
No, thank you. I think before we do that, Stefan, could we go back to the Wall of Belief slide? I think that's such an important slide, and we skipped over that. Could we just could you just explain how this works? Because I think this is fundamental to a lot of what you're saying. So can you just kind of explain, walk people through what this is and how it works?
I will do, and I will park the spiel about how we use the Wall of Beliefs here at Lynn and maybe speak to the toolkit itself. So the Wall of Beliefs is a toolkit that was developed by the Government Communications Service back in 2019. And the purpose of the toolkit was to try to connect some of the emerging science around how to address mis and disinformation with real world communicators. And the reason why those need to be connected is because the experiments that we do to try and understand how mis and disinformation lodges itself in people's minds and can be removed or addressed or rebutted takes place in a very insulated, far removed setting. And often that research wasn't being well translated in a way that could be used by practitioners. And so what the Government Communications Service did, working with the UK Government Cabinet Office and some of their behavioural scientists who we're lucky enough to work with today, they put together this toolkit which condensed everything we know about how to address mis and disinformation into a usable framework for deciding what to do with a piece of mis and disinformation. And the framework comes up with 4 decisions. And so the way to evaluate any piece of misinformation or disinformation you find online is to ask yourself 2 questions before thinking about how you might build a strategy to rebut it. And this normally applies to overarching organizations, but it will have some use and relevance to individuals who are out there on social media rebutting some of this stuff. So the first question to answer is, what is my definition of harm? What are the harmful behaviors that are relevant in this context? And the second question is, to what extent is this piece of misinformation part of somebody's core worldview or belief systems? So for example, in the context of harm, so let's take something like COVID-19. Let's take false cures, for example. So I mentioned bleach. So the piece of misinformation that injecting bleach is a cure for COVID-19, let's say that a hypothetical president of the free world took that up upon himself to push that as a cure for COVID-19. Now, first thing to say is that's incredibly dangerous because it encourages harmful behaviors that can cause real and immediate harm to people. And so it's something we need to discourage. But the second thing is when we think about, is it embedded in someone's metaphorical wall of beliefs, which is to say, is it part of their core beliefs? Is it something they hold on to very strongly? Or is it something more superficial? We can say it's more superficial. There aren't any political parties founded around the idea that bleach causes COVID-19. It is part of increasingly some political parties' way of seeing the world, but it's not part of their core philosophy. We don't have the bleach lobby funding huge amounts of political activity. So we can go ahead and engage what we call reactive response, where it's safe to rebut and challenge harmful beliefs directly. But if we take something like lockdown skepticism or resistance, here we have a behavior that's incredibly harmful to public health, but is much more part of someone's core identity or belief system or way of seeing the world, because it threatens their autonomy. And I think this gets to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about with regards to low traffic neighborhoods, which is wherever we have people feeling like their sense of autonomy is under threat, we have a belief that is embedded into their wall of beliefs as part of their core belief system. And so if we have a behavior like lockdown skepticism that is in this area, we focus on something called managed behaviors, which is much more relevant to organizations or governments. For example, it would include everything from enforcement of COVID-19 lockdown regulations, taping up every other table at a restaurant to ensure that people are set apart. This is focusing on behaviors first and beliefs later. The third one I want to draw your attention to, which is where I think we are in the low traffic neighborhood space, is the proactive promotion space, which is to say beliefs that don't directly cause harmful behavior, although increasingly so, but are embedded into people's core wall of beliefs, existing wall of beliefs. This is where we find a lot of the resistance to climate action is in this proactive promotion space. And that involves amplifying this clear, overarching narrative proactively rather than reactively, not at conspiracy theorists or those trolls on social media, but actually focusing on not feeding the trolls and instead focusing on proactively promoting our story to those key audiences who are reachable. And if we come down to here, you can see some recommendations from the Government Communications Service Toolkit, considering what needs misinformation beliefs are fulfilling within their audience, speaking to the fact that this is part of someone's core belief system, looking for new information and emerging evidence to highlight your argument, developing that consistent and coherent narrative that aligns with people's core values. This is about meeting, like I said, what does it mean to meet people where they are before bringing them with us? It's about understanding what they value and framing our messaging through those lenses. And at Lynn, we're lucky enough to be able to test some of these values frames, and we'll work with local authorities to try to understand, for example, we're working with a client on road user payment scheme and trying to understand which values lenses resonate with people the most, and discovered that actually it was the air pollution argument that was most resonant in this particular city. And we frame then all of our messaging through those lenses, but you don't need expensive polling and surveys to do that. A lot of us here know what our audiences care and value about. And there's a number of other recommendations you can see here, and it probably doesn't bode, it's not a good use of time to run through them in a linear way, but please, I will share these.
Yeah, let's pause there, Stefan. Thank you. So I think if we could just go back to the grid, just so people can see that. I think the key thing here is there's two axes, isn't there? There's is this belief embedded or not? And clearly for a lot of people, when it comes to low traffic neighborhoods, the sort of sense of, well, I should be free to drive wherever I like, and that we do seem to be touching a core belief there. On the harmful behavior one, I just wondered what's the definition of that? So some people have live in areas where actually people are conducting harmful behavior in that they're ripping out bollards or burning planters. But does that meet the definition of the belief can cause harmful behavior or not? Is this about harmful behavior as in if you drink bleach you're going to die, that sort of harmful behavior? Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, and this is where the the science meets the subjectivity, but it's still an important question to try to answer. And when we work with clients, it's the first question, or even before we work with them, I try to ask them, what do you define as harm in your context? And what you described there, I would absolutely consider to be harmful behavior. There is no messaging that is going to stop somebody from vandalizing a bollard if they feel that strongly about it.
So in that sense, would you say, if we play that through the grid, that ultimately the response might need to be that for those individuals, the reaction should be about managing the behaviours, so, you know, prosecuting them, but largely the response is about proactive promotion, because this is about getting your narrative across to the silent majority.
Exactly. It's often not an either or, but a both and situation. And I think in this context, we are moving into this kind of shared space of proactive promotion and managed behaviours. I think it's worth saying we shouldn't always despair, thinking about that optimism point that someone made earlier. We shouldn't despair about conspiracy theorists taking up this issue as something to campaign on. It is dark, and I've heard from colleagues and friends who are on the receiving end of a lot of this abuse, and I don't mean to belittle that in any way, but often these people are their own worst advocates. If we look at the broader polling on LTNs, climate action, the public's on our side for the most part, and they're certainly not on the side of people going around vandalizing public infrastructure. So in that sense, they're their own worst advocates. So we can, you know, it costs public money, it's a nuisance, it can damage projects, but I think often the challenge we find as advisors in this situation is not necessarily one of mass public opinion against these challenges. Often when we look at the data, what we find is, yeah, there might be some strong feeling, but often in most populations, it's unlikely to cause harmful behavior. And often what happens is we see that there's resistance to a change comes in, people see the realized benefits. And that
so
the challenge, sorry, Claire, just to finish that point, the challenge is actually the fear that it provokes among decision makers, who then feel like there's this false sense of consensus against the changes. And that's what I meant by the NIMBY lobby, who are active on social media. And I don't mean to trivialize it because it's important, but it's actually this noise on social media is scaring politicians out of making decisions that are actually incredibly popular. And our work is to help politicians realize that.
So we're going to get into some of the questions, and there's a good one from Mark, which is like a real life sort of scenario. Before we do that, can we just cover off the point about facts not being very good? You know, if we look at this grid, and actually the only box in which facts are useful are in that bottom right box, where you're actually trying to stop people drinking bleach rather than counter their core belief that they're being denied the freedom to drive wherever. So can you just give us a sense of why that is? Why don't facts work to counter facts in many scenarios, and largely in the instance of low traffic neighborhoods, countering what's going on with facts actually doesn't work and can sometimes be counterproductive? Could you just speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. So in general, truthful information that the evidence finds is a good thing. It's a net positive. It increases people's, generally in a net sense, in an average sense, it increases the majorities of people's understanding. What we find, though, is that actually fact checking in that sense doesn't create kind of meaningful behavior change in any way. So in that sense, facts are already limited. I suppose when we're talking about the difference between proactive promotion, which is where I think we are, and reactive response, which is where most of us are on social media, kind of playing that game of whack-a-mole, they both involve using accurate information. But proactive promotion isn't about addressing inaccuracies. It's about building accurate information into a coherent and consistent narrative that speaks to people's core values, whether that's concern for the safety of their children, concern for the future of their children, their desire to address the climate emergency. Reactive response also uses facts, but it uses facts in a more aggressive and direct way. And we need to be really careful about that, because if we're dealing with information that's likely to tap into people's core beliefs, addressing it in that direct way is risky. And that applies to in-person conversations as well. So I recommend people, if they're interested in how to have these conversations, look up the literature around something called deep canvassing. And deep canvassing is a way of structuring a conversation that's actually built on some of the evidence around behavior change in a healthcare setting, where somebody feels torn in two directions about whether to quit smoking, rather than whether they are for or against a low traffic neighborhood, or legislation for the LGBTQ community, whatever it is, whatever the culture war is. People's ambivalence in that setting often mirrors their ambivalence around making personal behavior change. And the evidence from both the healthcare setting and the political setting says when you're having those conversations with people, you're much better off starting from a place of active listening and affirming people's needs and concerns before you try to deliver your truth well told, rather than seeing it as simply a game of who can say the most number of facts, or who can back down each other's lies. And it's hard. I used to be an organizer in South London trying to get people out to vote. I know the temptation when somebody comes out with something eccentric on the doorstep to kind of bat it down. But often what I found was this paradox between when I settled into the fact that I have limited capability to change this person's mind, and the best thing I can do in this situation is in nourish my relationship with them in this very micro sense, versus this is a person whose mind I needed to change. It was actually the former that produced the best results rather than the latter.
Let's get into hearing from people. So Mark, I'm afraid I'm struggling to follow the chat, but you had a great example, Mark Strong. Could you just put your scenario to Stefan for him to test against the wall of beliefs grid?
Yes, it's quite simple in a way. So I'm in Brighton. There's a proposed low traffic neighbourhood in Hanover, which is a district with a lot of walking and cycling already. It's had a lot of flack. It's had a lot of the noise which you've referred to. I'm canvassing in the next door ward, so it's not actually in the area. Knock on the door, this woman who seems perfectly normal, and she says, oh, well, yes, of course, it seems very reasonable to have, you know, no entry signs and filters. And before you have that, then you're fined for going through these. And the next thing you know, you're following the World Economic Foundation's ideas, and there'll be gun turrets and ghettos, and you won't be able to travel between these areas without a license, and you'll be shot if you try to. So it jumped from straight to, and I find it's hard to relate, having had relatives who died in ghettos, to relate to anything that I find a standpoint with that viewpoint, you know. And the more you say anything, no, that's not happening, or I understand that you want to travel. She goes, well, you don't realise you're a stooge for this global conspiracy. So only thing to do in that case, I find, is to walk away, say thank you and go. But
yeah,
that feels like a loss.
Well, I think I appreciate your question, because it's one that resonates with me as somebody who's done my fair share of traveling through what can only be described as the gutter of the internet. I know that feeling of demoralization, despondency, and somebody who also has family who suffered at the hands of this kind of extremism. It's important to know where your energy is best placed and to protect that energy. And it might be in situations like that, your energy is best used elsewhere. And I wouldn't criticize anyone from walking away from a conversation like that. I think this speaks to a lot of things. It speaks to people's growing concern about globalization, and with that, decisions being made that are outside of their control. We spoke about those 3 C's earlier, control being one of those C's. It also speaks to people's sensitivity around their autonomy, which again plays into that control, this idea that the world's becoming more complicated, that the world we're moving into requires changes at such a scale that we will have to adjust to a new way of living. And that's incredibly scary for people. And a lot of that comes from this fear, and it's that fear trying to rationalize itself. I would say in situations like that, or more broadly, you may not be able to convince that individual, but the tying of these policies to the World Economic Forum presents an interesting challenge to us, which is, can we tell a story about this policy that means something specifically to our community? And I think a great example of that is what has been done by the Mayor of London around the ultra low emission zones, where they're finding examples of people in the community whose lives are being destroyed by poor air quality, whose life chances are being negatively impacted by poor air quality, and finding voices in the community who they can support and uplift and make that case. And that does 2 things. It makes it an immediate challenge rather than what people mistakenly perceive as a remote one, which is climate change, versus an immediate challenge, which is air pollution. But it also localizes it and it humanizes it. And we've got a much better chance protecting some of those people in the middle from those wild conspiracy narratives if we find a version of our story that is localized, that is real, and that is immediate and means something to our community.
Thanks, Stefan. I'm conscious we want to keep moving through so that we get a few more. Rachel, do you want to come in and ask your question? Sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
That's okay. So my question is, you do see people rebutting some of this stuff on the internet, but it's not very consistent. So I'm sort of thinking, particularly with LTMs and 15-minute cities, it kind of feels like we need to position them in the right way. So we all have kind of a set of statements, because I think what people need to see is a consistent voice from people like us. And I think also, I like the point about sort of listening, acknowledging, because that's really important, because half the battle is not getting into that argument straight off, but listening to what they've got to say, and then positioning LTNs and all the rest of it in a way in which they can tap into that. So, what does it mean? It means, you don't have to get in your car all the time. You can walk, you can go down the road and pick something up without driving through loads of, it's all about the sort of the positive, or like you've said, that proactive promotion. But I never feel like everybody's on message with this stuff. It's all everybody taking it in a different way. And I think it'd be really helpful if we had some sort of themes that we use constantly, because that's what you do in communications. You just, you pick on 2 or 3 things that we just keep going back with until people kind of get that this is about creating a better way of living.
Yeah, and I think that's half the battle. Half the battle is wrong. I'd say it's 80% of the battle. I think when we do our kind of frame testing or our message testing, 20% of the value comes from finding a frame that resonates with people. 80% of the value is having one thing you can point to and say, everybody say this, and start running off in different direction. And actually, that's where a huge amount of the value comes from. I think there's some core truths we can think about when it comes to messaging that resonates with people. I think we have to be sensitive to the current moment we're in. So for example, Rachel, we're working with a local authority client at the moment who came up with a road user charging scheme that involved small payments for cars driving through the city centre, which would be directly hypothecated into cheap £1 electric bus travel. And they were very happy with this policy. It spoke to a lot of their values. It was about redistributing income from wealthier parts of the city into poorer parts of the city that relied on public transport. We went ahead and tested that frame against some other frames, and we had to inform the client that it was the least popular frame out of all the frames we tested, because it's a cost of living crisis and people are paying their council tax and they don't understand why that doesn't give them access to buses now. Why are they being asked to pay for even more? And to me, that speaks to the importance of the context we're in, being mindful of arguments that maybe play into that context in a negative way. I'd say when it comes to sacred values, and this is something that the extremists understand, and not to speak about this in too much of a kind of cynical way, but the use of children as a storytelling device is so important. Anti-vaxxers use it all the time. Islamic radicalization movements use it all the time. This idea of children as these precious group to be protected is being weaponized by a lot of these folks. And actually, we have truth on our side, and particularly in LTNs, whether it's air pollution or future generations, a lot of those stories that tap into something that we all share, that we all care about, which is the well-being of young people, is often an extremely effective place to start with landing on what that story is. It's not, it's not poll focus group tested from me, but in terms of what I've learned through my travels through the guts of the internet, it's not a bad place to start.
Right, Stefan, let's keep moving. Thanks for that, Rachel. There's a question in the chat here about, are there any pointers if you find yourselves as members of the public in a public meeting and it's being dominated by loud conspiracy theorists? And there's a related question, which is, are there any times when you don't engage? And
yes,
yeah. So what about the first one? You're in a public meeting, you're a member of the public, conspiracy theorists are dominating. What do you do?
What can you do? I think it doesn't serve us well to get into shouting matches with these people. I would think more about, I'd bring it back to this question of harm, which is, what harm is being done by those shouting matches? And I'd say more often than not, it's the intimidation of some of those key local decision makers who are being intimidated out of taking these brave decisions. Make no mistake about it, these conspiracy theorists don't expect to, disassemble the new world order. But what the people fueling and funding them, including people spreading climate disinformation on a large scale, whether that's the far right or the oil industry, they understand that the effect that this kind of noise has is that it scares politicians out of making important decisions. And so in terms of our response, it might not be to respond directly on the night, but to reach out with a heartfelt letter to some of those councillors to remind them of what important, brave work they're doing and remind them how many people support them. The question of don't engage. Sorry, Claire, go on.
I was going to say, and to that end, that's obviously after the effect, but it sounds like we can predict some of this happening. So would you recommend that actually this is all best done up front? We know like low traffic neighbourhoods are going in, working with your local councillors to kind of prepare them and say, look, and focus on that higher truth. This is the message. You will get some conspiracy theorists. This is why you should ignore them. So how did any pre-work?
Yeah, I think tactically that's such an astute point. And I know I'm speaking to the preaching to the choir here in terms of people who are actively engaged in this, but do not underestimate the power of a thoughtful, considered message to a local political decision maker can have in terms of building their resilience to a lot of this noise. And absolutely, with all of this stuff, if you can get there proactively and set their expectations and say to them, there will be noise, there will be conspiracy theorists, they don't represent us. Here's my classroom, my kids' classroom, or a written letter from my kids' classroom, all the kids saying how important this is to them. Decision makers are humans and they respond to storytelling. On the point of don't engage, I think this is one of the most overlooked and most important things about what we can do. And it's why I've put it number one in this strategy for fighting misinformation if you're a human. Social media algorithms are designed to stoke and promote conflict, which means wherever we engage with a piece of content that has bad information in it, we're telling the algorithm this content is going to generate some heat, promote it and push it in front of more users' timelines because it'll keep them glued to their social media feeds and ultimately make more money for the platform from advertising. So the best thing that we can do is promote each other's messages and cross-post, cross-comment, retweet, as much co-engagement as we can. Every time some of us says something, we all comment underneath it. We start a conversation underneath it. We're proactive about liking and retweeting it, and we build out those networks. Disinformation spreaders and extremists are very good at this. And it's something that we need to be focusing more on as well. And I'm sure, again, preaching to the choir, I'm sure there's people here doing this already, but just be reassured that what you're doing does have an effect and is the way to address it, rather than distracting you from your key messages and wasting your energy playing whack-a-mole. Instead, let's focus on promoting our message and drowning out that noise.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stefan. Well, we could talk about this a lot longer, and hopefully we can perhaps see you again. I've taken from that, it's about focusing on the single higher truth and don't counter facts with facts necessarily. Let the conspiracy theories often be their own worst enemy. Thank you. Right, we're going to have our second speaker now. Stefan, if you can stay, I'm sure there might be questions in the chat. Chris, over to you. You doing all right, Chris?
Okay. Yep, I've got unmuted. Let me share my screen. Right. Okay. So, as Claire said, I'm Chris. I used to be a counsellor and involved in active travel in Greater Manchester.
Sorry, Chris, we're not seeing anything at the moment. Have you got your slides up?
I'm on share screen, I thought.
We can't. Well, I don't think we can see them at the moment, no.
Okay.
Make it a group therapy session.
The one thing I was going to say about this was, it feels to me like this stuff is quite psychological in its approach, but is there there's almost a need here for like a consistent sort of cheat sheet. This is going to happen. These are the things that are going to be used. And this is the messaging and the way you need to deal with this. And this almost needs to be something that either comes from the government in terms of, the active travel toolkit, and it's an addendum on there, or then, because in some ways, you're right. This isn't about whether or not they shout at me or we shout at them or we try and argue against their points. All they care about is intimidating the local politicians. That weather vane politics sort of approach, which is, I'm getting a lot of noise from here, I better not do this. Yeah. Rather than, and how do we counter that? Is there like a cheat sheet being produced by anybody, or is there one that we should have? That's that sort of thing.
You're absolutely spot on. And actually, when we we're a comms consultancy, so our remit isn't super broad, but when we do work with clients, a huge part of what we do is translating our research into toolkits. So for example, we're working in Wales at the moment, supporting the Welsh government on the 20-mile-an-hour changes that are being brought in. Speed limits are changing by default from 30 to 20, and production of toolkits in terms of what approach to take is a huge part of this. Adam, after the session, I'll make sure those slides get shared. And if you look on those slides, there's two toolkits referenced. One is called Resist 2.0, and the other one is the Wall of Beliefs, which we've discussed. Those are effectively cheat sheets, not specific to this issue, but more broadly cheat sheets that have come from government communication and Cabinet Office. They're long, but they're useful. And what I would recommend is immersing yourself in them, and you'll quickly find relevance to your specific situation. They're kind of just broad enough to give you that. But please, once you've had a chance to take a look at them, always happy to catch up and discuss how to make them as useful as possible. I'm the government's biggest cheerleader for these toolkits. I think they're fantastic. So I hope people find value in them.
Adam, I've just posted in the chat the Wall of Beliefs page from the government website. It is really good, but it is long, as Stefan says. So the info is there, but perhaps not a cheat sheet, more of a cheat chapter. Bob.
Oh, I mean, this is all really, really interesting, I think. I think it's absolutely key. I'm due to be giving a short talk at Active Travel Cycle County at Oxford later in July on this subject. And thing is, I'm just sort of throw this out there as a sort of, in a way, it's a kind of counter to sort of how reasonable you've been, that, sometimes I feel, particularly with the ones who there's no point in engaging with anyway, because they're just not going to change, that I kind of think sometimes I just feel the need to say that I'm right and the others are wrong. And, to do that for your own mental health, I mean, this is, in my experience as being a local authority worker, it's sometimes if people, certainly if they're abusive, and if they're aggressive and so on, that you have to do that. And it kind of links in with what I think, and what I've been looking at for about 30 years, is the sort of things that Ian Walker talks about with motor normativity. And it's about
Bob, let's let Stefan come back on your initial point, which is, how does one handle things when it's really pushing your emotional buttons?
I sympathize with that deeply, and one of the most useful pieces of advice I was ever given was by my boss when I was working at the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which was where I first got my experience of roaming around in the gutter of the internet. And I found it incredibly difficult and emotionally draining, a huge part of that role. And it was this, I suppose, this feeling of almost being gaslit by huge swathes of the internet into thinking that up is down and down is up. And my boss essentially said to me, you have to make a decision. Do you want to do this for a profession and have no social media in your personal life, or do you want social media in your personal life and do something else for a profession? I think what he was speaking to there is the fact that being exposed to conspiracy theories, wherever they land on the spectrum, is like being exposed to radioactive waste in a sense. And if we find ourselves swimming around in it for too long, it degrades us and our energy. So I do not dispute the therapeutic value of asserting that someone is wrong. I find myself doing it with members of my own family sometimes. And I think it's important to forgive ourselves for that, because we care about these issues and they're important. And sometimes we're not always going to be zen and forgiving of these people. But to remember that in order to protect our own energy and effectiveness, we sometimes have to insulate ourselves. And I think I've had some quite profound experiences on some quite radical parts of the internet where I've seen community discussion around ideas I find ridiculous, or in some cases abhorrent, where I've been genuinely touched by the fact that what I'm looking at is people who lack things in their lives finding a sense of community and purpose, and that in a different universe or in a different time or growing up in a different situation, they could have been me as well. And it's the circumstances of their life that led them to see the world in that way. Now, I don't claim to always have that level of zen and perspective. So instead, what I do is I insulate myself and expose myself in a very limited way to the toxicity when I can, when I need to, and when it's useful.
That's interesting how honest that is. Bob, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's very thoughtful, and you know, that's true. And I remember years ago a well-known cycle campaigner suggesting that we have some sort of pity for people who are so messed up in many ways. But what I was just going to get onto, and this is where it gets tricky, is that so far we've been dealing with people who are often conspiracists and, you know, sort of at the wacky end of things. What I think I'm more kind of interested in, have been for a long time, is the sort of thing that Ian Walker talks about as being motor normativity, where there are sort of less apparently dangerous background beliefs which are widely shared amongst a large proportion of the people who have not yet got to that stage of being sort of, you know, the wackos who think there's going to be roadblocks everywhere. And that's the sort of really interesting thing I'm interested in, of people who kind of, you know, just kind of go along with the sort of ideas which lead to more and more car use and general carelessness. So that's the sort of, you know, it's about that kind of spectrum between, and I'm more interested in the kind of core beliefs at the sort of moderate end.
Well, you know, I think a lot of this isn't about information, it's about relationships. I think back to when I was a teenager. I was brought up in a mixed religious household, but I went to a Catholic school. And I think about a friend of mine who, both of us lost our faith, as it were, around a similar age, around 13, where you're a young, impressionable man looking for role models and guidance and stuff. And we both lost our faith around that time. And I suppose looking for new role models and new things that we can invest ourselves in. And we were both at the time, YouTube was becoming more kind of more widely used. It was still in its early days, but what was happening to both of us, we were researching a lot of these YouTube videos about atheism, and what the algorithms of YouTube were doing was pushing us more away from kind of discussion and debate around atheism, more to explicitly critical content of the Islamic faith, more so than other areas. And it's quite a well-documented algorithmic trail now that lots of people around that age were being pushed towards some of these more extreme areas of the internet. But what's really interesting is that friend of mine who lost his faith around a similar time and started researching atheism and debates about God, he's a conspiracy theorist now. And I think a lot about him and the environment that he was in and how we ended up in two different directions. And you know, we were both fairly fringe in terms of, you know, on the social fringes. We weren't particularly cool. I'm in Wales and I'm terrified of playing rugby, which lowered my social stock, and so was he. And so we're both on these fringes, and there were different vulnerabilities. But I think about the relationships I had in my life, having parents who came from two different, quite diverse backgrounds, living in a diverse area of the city, being exposed to people of different cultures, and having
Stefan, I'm sorry to rush you, but we're going to try and get the second speaker back. So
Bob, let's pick this up
separately.
I appreciate you asking that question.
I'm very sorry because that's so interesting, but I do want to give Chris a chance to pitch. So Chris, over to you. And I'm not sure whether you're going to use slides or not, but we're going to give it a go. And this is Chris Paul, who's pitching this next week to the Department of Transport.
Thanks, Claire. Sorry about the slides mess up. I won't get slides next week, so it's perhaps a good chance. So last January, the Transport Select Committee advertised for 500-word proposals, making a strong case for a future transport policy and to make a good case for why it needed to be taken up now and why it needed to be subject of government action. I pitched a parking-related theme because I was doing an essay at the University of Manchester about the environmental costs of parking, and it seemed to me that actually you could lay the blame for all problems with roads and cars and traffic and air pollution and noise and everything on parking, because parking is a real enabler for movement and road use. So the other people pitching are mainly big transport, so lots of trains. There's a light rail one. There's a couple that are more related, which is Como UK and the TRL are doing curbside usage. So as I say, I chose to pitch parking policy in practice. So I start by saying that cars typically spend 95% of their life stationary, parked or stored, and use little of their fuel to move the occupants. Each trip begins and ends with a stationary vehicle, and vehicles with capacity to carry 4 or more people are often used as single occupancy. Vehicles are typically capable of driving at several times the speed limit in towns, and parking may be on or off road, at home or at work, at shopping, leisure, school and health. In most cases, parking and storage of vehicles in the UK is poorly thought through. Parking policy in practice often seems controversial and can be triggering, which takes us back to the last talk. Supply of parking influences the amount of driving, and as with highways, reducing supply or charging more for it may reduce the driving, and increasing supply of parking may induce driving. As driving is widely recognised as a source of many harms and reductions in liberties, as well as benefits and increases in liberties, and as parking, which may reduce or induce driving, is part of that, it should be studied and understood by this Transport Select Committee. Parking is an issue independent of vehicle power plant being required by both private ICE vehicles and electric vehicles. So we can demand, unless and until there is more sharing, more passenger transport, or more AVs helping provide mobility as a service, that we need to get on top of parking. So road harms, you'll all be familiar with this, that the harms that are typically included in calculations are global heating, congestion, collisions and casualties, causing inactivity, chronic air quality issues, and causing noise pollution, which is calculated to be 20 times as serious from roads as it is from airports. The Cabinet Office back in the late noughties estimated it was about 50 billion a year, and subsequently other estimates, including from Chris Boardman and others, took it to 80 towards 100 billion per annum. And this is huge because, for example, in Manchester, in Greater Manchester, that means 4 billion a year, whereas our total health bill, health and care bill, is only 6 billion. So the other harms that are not typically calculated include the opportunity lost, cost of the space, the spatial planning effects, the isolation and loneliness and other mental health challenges, and the dampening effect on passenger transport. Many of these harms are known to fall most heavily on those with protected characteristics under the Equalities Act and in the lowest income deciles, while automobility is most prevalent and most beneficial to those in the highest deciles. If we accept that the amount of motor vehicle activity is influenced strongly by the supply of parking, particularly undervalued parking, just as it is by the supply of highways running lanes, then we can regard parking supply as also responsible for these very considerable social and economic costs, and also as a potential relatively easy lever to reduce those harms. There are a large number of potential research questions relating to parking in the UK. And while there is an academic literature and a number of overview reports on parking, it's under-researched and under-considered in the UK and Europe compared to the USA. So some questions that the committee might concern themselves with and the academic community. What is the total supply of parking spaces in UK localities? How much is in use at any time? What influence does this have on the headline number of vehicles and on driving? How is parking policy used in other territories to reduce road harms? How does roadside parking impact on the capacity for vehicular movement, including active travel modes and passenger transport, as well as private vehicles? And how does free and undercharged roadside parking affect air quality and carbon? Is cruising for curbside parking really responsible for almost 75% of air pollution and transport carbon use in some urban centres? How does the supply of free curbside parking in residential areas impact on car buying decisions, on the space available for water and plants, on the space available for walking and rolling? What is the suppressing effect of pavement parking on walking and rolling on footways? Over the decades, approximately every 20 years, there have been key texts referring to parking issues in the UK, but it often seems very little attention has been paid by successive governments and local authorities to the recommendations. The ones I've chosen as representative of that source of stream of literature: Traffic in Towns from 1963, the Buchanan Report, the Urban Renaissance Report from the Environment Department for the Environment in 1980, which was basically hand-wringing, the Urban Renaissance Report from Lord Rogers in 1999, which was brilliant and suggested workplace parking levies everywhere, suggested home streets, and suggested that 65% minimum of the transport budget be spent on active travel and passenger transport for at least the next 10 years, which of course never happened. And then in 2019 and thereon, there's been various reports about the decarbonisation of transport, including by Greg Marsden. And these have kind of summarised the issues around parking, as well as the other issues for us all in dealing with parking and decarbonisation. So I wanted to say one thing about the Traffic in Towns report, which is regarded by some as being a bit of an open door for what actually happened, which was the sort of dominance of the car coming through from the 63 when it was written to now. Actually, if you read between the lines, it was very negative about the way things were going with cars, and it just really wanted things to be done to prevent and restrict cars. But it actually shows a prediction of the number of vehicles, which is almost spot on, saying 34 million cars for 2010. Hardly an error at all there, and that was written in 1963.
Chris, I'm afraid we've just got 2 minutes left, and I thank you for sharing the kind of weight of the argument that is overwhelming. In one sentence, are you actually pitching to the government, to the Department of Transport, that they essentially should have a parking strategy that they don't currently have? Is that the pitch?
The pitch is that the Transport Select Committee should study this with a view to treating it very seriously compared to the last 60 years. What I suggest we do is I send my slides to you, Claire, and you do share them as if they've been shown. And there's an email address on that, and anyone that's got any suggestions on how to improve it. What I've read is exactly what I pitched in writing to them, the 500 words, because I think the only way to get that on the record in Hansard, etc., is actually to read it. But then there's 15 minutes of questions and chances to elaborate. So anyone that's listening who's got some suggestions on how to make it better, how to make the 500 words better, and how to induce the right sort of questions to land the parking strategy we need, would be very welcome.
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, if you send me your slides, we can share them as soon as possible. And I'm sure there are definitely people on this chat who are really interested in this subject. And ultimately, I'm struck by your point that, yeah, we've got a curbside strategy in Lambeth, Birmingham, Edinburgh now, but actually nationally, it's a wasteland. It's a free for all. Thank you, Chris. And one bit of feedback I just don't want you to miss in the chat. It's just about, question about when are you presenting to Parliament, and good luck from us.
So it's on the afternoon of the 9th of May, so 1 week today, and it's towards the end of the session, so I think it's around 4 p.m. and the session starts about 3. I think I might be on about 4:30, and there's a further session on the Wednesday morning. So 6 of them on the Tuesday afternoon rather, and 6 on the Wednesday morning.
Brilliant. Well, good luck, Chris. And if you send us your slides, we'll get them up as soon as we can so people can see and respond to you. So we've come to the end of our session tonight. Thank you, everyone. Really, really interesting stuff from Stefan. And I, for one, think we should, carry on with that theme at a future session. If people have suggestions for talks, or if they want to try something out like Chris has done tonight, I've seen something in the chat from someone who's got an idea. We're a community, so you're free to suggest how you would like to use this community as well. So do drop us a line, activetravelcafe@gmail.com. Thank you to everyone, especially our speakers. Bit of feedback in the chat, Chris, about your camera setup, which might be useful for you. Thank you all. We've got our a session next week. See anyone there? It's the elections this week. We haven't even mentioned them, so let's hope that anyone standing on an anti-low traffic neighbourhood ticket doesn't do very well. We will find that out next week, and we're hoping to be joined by Adam Clark, who's one of the leading councillors in Leicester, to talk about the workplace parking levy. So Ruth, one of our regulars, thank you, Ruth, for helping line that one up, which we hope he'll be able to do if he wins his election seat. So thank you, everyone.